And so what we want to talk about today is how you can teach government analytics in a way that is hopefully relatively low cost for you, in a way that even if you haven't previously thought about this before coming to this session, is something that you can incorporate in your course teaching or even teach a new course on. And we want to do that in 2 steps. We first want to talk about how you could teach a single module, a single session on government analytics, and then we want to talk about how you could deliver a full course at your university, at your training school on government analytics. So let's imagine that all you have space for in your existing curriculum, for instance, previous slide, please. Thank you. In your existing curriculum, so for instance, in your curriculum on a public administration course or in your curriculum on a data for policy analysis course, let's imagine that all you have time for is sort of a single week, a single session. How could you teach that? So if you have 2 hours for government analytics, our suggestion is that you in essence cover what are chapters 1 and 2 of government analytics. They cover what government analytics is and why it matters. They cover the public administration production function that Dan just introduced to you. They cover the range of different data sources that you can use to analyze different components of the function. For instance, is my bottleneck in the inputs? Is my bottleneck in the culture? It gives students a sense of what are the kind of data sources that are available to explore that. And then lastly, we also suggest that you introduce students to the range of existing available global tools that make it relatively low cost, particularly if they exist in your country, that make it relatively low cost to do government analytics. So for instance, the Global Survey of Public Servants, talk about that again in a few slides. PROACT, which is a database of procurement contracts. Where such data is available, it makes it much lower cost for you to do government analytics because the data source is already there. Where such data is not available, you often have to collect it yourself. Now, if you use this content in the next slide, then you could assign chapters 1 and 2 of the Government Analytics Handbook as your core reading for the week. And we always would encourage you to complement that sort of lecture content style with an exercise. And the key exercise for students to really understand what is the relationship between a management problem and the government analytics that I need to do is for them to pick a management challenge in their public administration to try to locate this challenge in the public administration function. For instance, is a challenge for, in terms of quality of management practices? Is it a challenge in terms of how we procure goods and services? And once they've done that, then for students to think about what is the kind of data source that I need to analyze that challenge. And once they've done that, then for students to go out and explore whether for the administration they're interested in, that data would actually be available for analytics. So if you had a 2-hour session with students, this is our suggestion for how you could teach it. Now, we of course very much hope that in this call you're going to give more pride of place to government analytics in your teaching. So let's imagine for a moment that you could deliver a whole course on government analytics, meaning either a 5-day course, executive education course, where you teach in the morning and the afternoon, or a 10-week university course where you have 10 weeks and each week you have 3 hours, for instance, with your student. So if you had that amount of time with your student, then our suggested content in essence follows the structure of the training that we will deliver to the government analytics fellows. And the advantage of following that structure is that means that the video recordings for the sessions are available. The presentation slides will be available and we'll make them editable so you can adapt them to your needs. It means exercises, assignments are available. So that means, in other words, all the material that you need to teach the course would be available for you and would make it feasible for you to deliver a similar course. Now, beyond that content that I will introduce in a second, we would also suggest that you have a core assessment for students, which we also run in the fellowship, and that is for them to complete an actual government analytics project, for them to understand when you really work with a government analytics data source, what are all the challenges? What are all the ways in which I have to be careful about using this data? What are the kind of implications and inferences that I can really draw? So how would that course, 10-session course look like? So you will have seen that the Government Analytics Handbook has 5 parts. And the course loosely, but not fully, follows those 5 parts. So the first part is the overview part. These are 3 chapters that give students a sense, or readers a sense, of what government analytics is, why it matters. The second part of the handbook is about foundational themes. So here you have chapters that assess cross-cutting challenges that you have, or that you need to think about when you do government analytics. For instance, the ethics of government analytics. For instance, the importance of a balanced data suite, that you often need multiple different data sources to holistically understand a single management problem. And then parts 3 to 5 are about different data sources that are available to do government analytics. So part 3 is about administrative data, for instance, procurement data, payroll data, HMIS data, case data. Part 4 is about public servant surveys. This is about how you can deliver effective, design, implement, and report on effective surveys of public servants. And part 5 is about external assessments, for instance, surveys of citizens, surveys of households, and what you can learn from them to diagnose and improve public administration. Now, the course loosely follows this structure, but gives a little bit more early pride of place to surveys of public servants, largely because it's the data source that is typically most intuitive to participants. Everyone in their life will have completed a survey. It'll be easier. Many of them will have completed even a survey of public servants. It's easy for them to relate to that before you then go into data sets such as procurement data or payroll data that many participants wouldn't have had prior exposure to. So how can then a 10-session course look like? Session 1 would in essence cover what we just discussed earlier in this 2-hour session. What is government analytics? Why does it matter? So this is chapters 1 and 2 of the book plus exercises. Session 2, we would suggest, is all about these foundational themes. Here we would give particular pride of place to this idea of thinking about a balanced data suite, the idea that you need multiple different data sources to understand one particular management challenge. And you also want to give particular pride of place to ethics, because oftentimes the kind of data that you have, microdata that you have about government organizations identifies individual public servants, which means you need to be careful about data protection, you need to be careful about the ethics of this. So these are in essence chapters 4 and 6. And then sessions 3 and 4, we would suggest you dedicate to surveys of public servants. You can have one session on really focusing on the design of surveys of public servants. How do you design an effective questionnaire that really captures the topics and concepts that you need to capture for your management challenge? How do you phrase effective survey questions? And also, who should you be surveying when you want to address the particular management challenge that you want to diagnose? And then session 4 is all about, once you have the survey data, how can you analyze it effectively? How can you report on it effectively? How can you make sure that these results really inform better conversations about management improvements? For both of those, we again have exercises. One of them draws on the early chapters on the survey volume. The second, session 4, is the later chapters in the survey volume, chapters 24 to 26. And then after that, we would suggest that you have 3 sessions that focus on 3 core administrative data sources that every government has to some extent and that you can use to diagnose public administration. Session 5 is about introducing administrative data sources generally, and then looking at one particular administrative data source, which is case data. The idea that if you are a public administration organization that processes cases, for instance, a social security organization, a tax office, passport applications, driver's licenses, you're always processing cases, for instance, applications for a driver's license. You can use that data to understand productivity. And so this session is all about how can you repurpose this data to measure and improve productivity. Session 6 is then about another data source that all governments have and that typically is really important in the overall public expenditure, and that is procurement. And it's about how can you analyze procurement records to improve the way that government procures. And then session 7 looks at another data source all governments have, which is payroll data. Every government has a payroll. It pays public servants every month, for instance, a certain amount, and you can use those records to understand better human resources and public sector pay more generally. And so again, the idea is you have a chapter in the book, in this instance, chapter 10, and then you have exercises that really help students understand how you can take a payroll data set and do those analytics. And then session 8 is a session that gives students a glimpse of the range of other data sources that are available to measure productivity. You can ask citizens, sometimes you can get measures of process, sometimes you can get measures of task completion. Particularly the first two is not something that all governments have, but it's something that all governments could potentially collect, and it's something that can complement the other data sources. And then the course concludes with 2 final sessions. So in session 9, the idea is to give your participants a sense of, now that we've covered all of these data sources, how do they all come together? So for instance, we have chapter 8, which does in the handbook, which does this exercise for the case of corruption. If you want to diagnose corruption, what are all the data sources that are available for you that within the core public administration, from detecting ghost workers to detecting procurement fraud, to detecting leakages in your budget data, to detecting unethical leadership inside your public sector organizations? There are a range of different data sources that all shed light on this particular management challenge. And so this is about how can you bring them together to get a holistic understanding of that challenge. But then it's also about how can you generate capacity for that, for this kind of holistic assessment, for the analysis of all of these data sources inside government, which is ultimately then about the future of government analytics in your administration. And then we suggest that you dedicate session 10 really to students' projects, and then presenting their projects, showing you what they have done with their particular analytics, and then you helping them improve the project or giving them an assessment for that particular project. So this is a suggested structure for the course. And as mentioned earlier, we are so keen to help you be able to implement a course like that in your particular organization, in your School of Public Administration, in your university. And so we're trying to make as many resources as possible available for that. You will have probably already seen that there is a website with a range of documentation about the book. There's, of course, the book itself. There's also an author video, which gives you a brief introduction into government analytics that you can access, and we'll, of course, share these slides with you afterwards. These are all clickable links. On our website, there's also links to different tools that you can use in your teaching that make it easier for you, for instance, to showcase existing data that is available about a certain part of the production function. So for instance, one tool, if we go to the next slide, is the Global Survey of Public Servants. So if you go to the website here, globalsurveyofpublicservants.org, you can see that there's an indicator or data dashboard tab that allows you to explore data from 29 countries, over 1.4 million public servants that have in essence responded to surveys of public servants. So it's an initiative to try to improve the practice of surveys of public servants, to try to harmonize those surveys of public servants, but really also to make data available for others to use, and also data you can use in your teaching then. But then, of course, beyond that, as alluded to at the beginning, we're very keen that after we finish the Government Analytics Fellowship, we'll make the course slides available in an editable format so you can take what you want for your own teaching. From that, we'll also record our own teaching so you can see how we teach it, take the best of that, and make it even better in your university or school. We'll also upload all the teaching exercises that we're doing. And we're very keen to support you if you have questions about how to teach this in your university. If you want to set up a 10-week course, or in your National School of Public Administration, you want to set up an executive course and you have questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. We're very keen for this to be something that is taught around the world, and very keen to support that process. So thank you so much again for your attention, for being here today. Very much look forward to the conversation with you and to how we can support you in teaching this. Thank you.
So thank you so much for your patience, everyone. That was an overview of what we think government analytics is and why we think you should teach it, with some suggestions of how we might teach it. We would love to hear from you, what your questions are, what your ideas are. We are at a little bit over half past, but we've got much of the rest of the hour to really hear your thoughts on, is this a topic that you think your students will be interested in? How would you think about, taking this forward? So the floor is very much open. It's also an opportunity to learn a bit about who you are. So please start any question with a brief introduction to yourself, and over to everybody on the call. Ebenezer first, and then Kennedy.
Well, good morning. Good evening from the Philippines. I'm Ebenezer Florano, professor at the University of the Philippines. And unluckily, I was not selected. Anyway, I'm very much interested in the topic. Yes, I will, because I'm really interested to teach the government analytics. So I'll maximize using your resources you've mentioned. Hopefully, you can also give us the PowerPoint, copies of the PowerPoint available. And then I'm teaching public administration, actually, policy analytics. Okay, and also I'm a convener for the data science for public policy. I would like to look for opportunities to invite you or to share your knowledge with us at the University of the Philippines. Like, for example, the 10 session course. So I might need to write, I think, formal writing. I need to email you about that. So if you could help us, for example,
Absolutely.
have this executive program.
Absolutely.
Okay,
And
the third
Ebenezer,
is
so let me begin by just saying thank you very much for staying up quite late. Working internationally is always a challenge, and we really appreciate you being online so late. Christian and I have both done exactly what you're saying, which is we're happy to drop into your curriculum, at some
yes,
point and give a small introduction. Clearly, you are the best person to teach your students. But if you
so
think we can be useful at some small point, we
yes, you
have
will be
done
very,
that, and
very much useful. Very much useful. So I
absolutely
will email you about this, about our interest.
wonderful.
Perhaps next year we can start something about that. My concern is there a chance for us teachers to be invited next year for a face to face really training on this
Absolutely.
government analytics? So give us a
Our
chance to.
intention is to find a wider range of funding that would allow us to actually have a specific set
Okay.
of trainings. I don't see this as us training you. It is a conversation between teachers,
Yeah.
and you are of as much expertise as us. So I think having a community, yes, DC is a nice place to visit, maybe in the spring. So we certainly are trying to invest in finding
Yes.
those funds, and it is our intention to have something more on teaching for sure.
Thank you
For
very
now,
much.
thank you for your patience, and Ebenezer, it's a pleasure to
Yeah,
have
because
spoken
we
to
have,
you.
teachers have multiplier effects. We can teach it to
I
our
couldn't
students.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely.
And
Over
then
to
the last
Kennedy.
is actually more of a question. What would be the final outcome of the research project? Because I'm used to my subject about public policy. I think it can also be used. The output can be used also to come up with public policies at the office level or government level, what we call internal policies. Actually, will that also be considered as a final project output?
Certainly, we now know that the quality of public administration mediates how effectively public policy is implemented. And so even if you have a very effective policy, you may find that having the weaker administration actually reduces or disables the impact of public policy itself. And so we believe that there's a big interaction between the two. At the same time, there are topics that are purely important in the service itself. We want a service that has attributes and characteristics that is managed well, that even if they didn't have long frontline impacts, we want
Yes.
a non-corrupt, we want a depoliticized service. These are all things which that are goods in themselves. Now I'm going to switch to Kennedy and Ebenezer. I can't wait to continue the conversation with you.
Yes.
Mr. Madugu, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I will
Thank
email
you.
you.
Thank you very much, Christian and Daniel, for that wonderful presentation. Deeply appreciate. I took a look at the text itself and think it's well written. I mean, a lot went into it. I must commend the efforts of you and your team for what you've done. Now, to my question, yeah, when I looked at the text and indeed your presentation a while ago, I can see that there is a presumption that data is available everywhere. In other words, there is this concept of big data, wherein we believe that there is a large volume of data across the globe. But unfortunately, this is only applicable to the global north. To the global south, it's a different ballgame altogether. Now, let's look at the case of Nigeria, for example. Now, ideally, it is expected. Oh, sorry, I didn't introduce myself properly. I'm a professor of accounting and finance, and I also teach public policy at the postgraduate school here in the United Arab Emirates. I'm in Dubai, precisely. So there is this belief that there is an amount of data that is so large that we can simply analyze. Now, as someone who teaches data science, machine learning at the postgraduate level using government data, I can tell you for a fact how difficult it is to source these big data in quotes. So I want to ask, so what will the DIME and of course the World Bank be doing to assist in data gathering, especially from the perspective of developing countries? Because for the most part, you talked about the public service, how data is available in the public service, but I can tell you for a fact that for developing countries, they themselves even withhold data. They don't have data. I can tell you that. So in that conundrum of paucity of data, how do you intend to now analyze what does not exist? And my second question will be based on textual analysis, or what you call text analytics. And beyond the numerical data, are you considering also incorporating textual analytics so that we can use that to glean actionable insights to make recommendations for policy actions by the government of different countries, especially in this case, the UAE and of course, Nigeria?
Thank you, Kennedy. Let me start responding, and then Dan can come in with a particular question about the World Bank's fantastic question. And thank you so much also for your interest, Kennedy. I think, let me take a step back and sort of note that one of the key exercises we always have across the sessions is for students to try to understand what existing data is actually there about their public administration. And it's always a case that some data sources are available, other data sources are not available. If they're not available, what do? We have a chapter in the handbook about creating data infrastructures, which sort of takes the example of human resource management information systems and looks at how the development of those systems means you can go from a less mature to a more mature system, which ultimately allows you to do the analytics. So there is a requirement for data infrastructure before you can analyze data. And we go sort of in every session, we come back to this question of, is the data available, but also of what quality is the data available? If it is available, this is also crucial. So for us, this is really important. I should also note that I think in our own work, because we've both done this work in many countries, you're sometimes surprised about what kind of data is available where. So there's some, very low-income countries that happen to have a centralized payroll where the data is available, and then there's some high-income countries that do not have it, where the data is not available. So there are more data sources available than you might think, in part because so many governments, as Dan mentioned at the beginning, have moved towards this digitization of management systems. And oftentimes this digitalization meant that there are records, but the records are not used as data points. So they might tell you they don't have data, but they actually have the records, which could be repurposed for data. And so in the teaching, and this is something that, of course, if you teach this is also really important, is always have this interplay between what is it that you could do with the data and what is data that is actually there or that could be repurposed. And then there was a question about the World Bank and DIME that I'll let Dan respond to.
This is an excellent question. I think you're right. The presentation in some sense doesn't note how respectful we are of the limitations that sometimes people face. Firstly, there is the ability to repurpose, as Christian's saying. Sometimes we're surprised at how little, and textual analysis being a perfect example, how little people have conceived of the data sources that are there. Secondly, there is the option to do primary data collection. But then thirdly is one can repurpose data which sometimes isn't really seen as useful for government functioning assessments. So for example, household survey data with the right identifiers for public, private, will really give you a really strong sense of what is happening in the labor markets of the public sector. And there's a chapter on how to use household survey data, for example, which actually Nigeria, you mentioned Nigeria, I actually worked in Nigeria for many years. The household survey data in Nigeria is outstanding. It's, very rich. And so being able to use what's there, I think the intention here, and, whether DIME, the World Bank, are part of it or not, is to do two things. One is to try to lower the cost for individual measurement initiatives. And so when I did my own work in Nigeria with the presidency and the office of the head of the civil service, there was very limited foundations for doing surveys of public servants or measures of outputs, task completion. I think the handbook is trying to make the cost of the next person doing the additional work, be it public servant or otherwise, lower. And so now, if you go to the Global Survey of Public Servants, for example, all of the survey questions are there. You don't have to use them, but they're inspiration for what you might use. Survey data, comparative survey data is there, so you can offer that to government stakeholders and say, look, if you allow me to do a survey, or if you allow us to jointly do a survey, you'll have this comparative work that you can use. So not to in any way diminish the task of, in the Global South, trying to create new data sets. At the same time, I think there is a lot we can do to move the needle. And it's probably, academics and students like yourselves who, in some sense, you could be a driving force of creating new data for the Global South that hasn't been there before. So anything we can do to lower the cost of you starting that with your students, with your work, is very well received. Text analysis is a perfect example. There is, in Nigeria and elsewhere, just volumes of text coming out of government, and that is put online. Now, we didn't have a chapter in the handbook. I actually have spent a good amount of time over the last 3 years trying to do textual analysis within public service. It is, I think, still at a very nascent stage. You're teaching this, so you will be able to tell us much better. But I don't think we felt there was a sufficient evidence base yet to do this. At the same time, you're at the frontier. So, we would love to hear from you if you think there are opportunities to expand the use of textual analysis for understanding government functioning. Perhaps you could email us, we can share it with the community and so forth. So excellent questions. There is certainly a battle for new data and for capitalizing on old. I hope you and your students are going to be part of that battle. Now I'm going to pause for a moment and see there's a couple of questions in the chat. And if Professor Kamoni or Dr. Kamoni would like to come on and ask his question, if anyone wants to come in who's already said, put their question in the chat, otherwise I will say it. So I'll just wait for a moment if Dr. Kamoni wants to come in. Very good. So, his question here, even getting data for normal research in simple processes such as procurement is a tall order. Even when data is not available, access is a problem. I think that's a very good tension. Often the data now is increasingly available, but it's access. And so in some sense, the conversation is, what do you offer to your government counterpart in terms of analysis, in terms of joint assessment that enables you the kind of access that you have? So, we had talked about the bank's role, and we are trying to support greater issuing of administrative data. We're actually working with the Boost public data set around budgets to try and make all of that data public. But procurement data, there is already an initiative called ProAct. And so it's worth looking at the ProAct website, which is linked in the handbook toolkits, just to see if data from your country is there or from a country of interest. At the same time, trying to think about what it is that we can offer a government so that you get access for you and maybe your students to do this work is something that we'd happily have further conversations on. Would Seema Sirohi like to ask her question?
It's not a question, but overall dynamics towards the data, where in Indian education system, uh, teachers' salary, teachers' training are the some areas where the data is managed, but rest of the areas data is not managed. Data is also seen from a political angle, where collection of data, taking decision on the data is a political choice rather than just a governance choice, right? In that scenario, like, how do we process educational governance in a better way? If the government analytical team can provide some case studies where institutionally education scenario has been improved using certain aspect of data, so we understand there is some commonality among different domain. For example, how do we manage our resource within education, within health and all? These aspects will remain common. So how do we deal with data in that sense? And there are specific elements of education which needs to be dealt with in a different connotation, because it's education which vary from any other domain. Then how do we manage data and how do we support the government in using that data differently? So what I wanted to say is, like, different domain deserve a different carefulness consideration when it comes to data, because data can be used to take a better decision, but data can also drive us into taking other kind of decisions. But using data is a political choice, and in developing countries that does not come very easily.
So the three areas that you touched on, case studies where these things have both been successful and failed, and trying to understand them as teaching tools, we completely agree. And I think that's going to be something we're working on over the next year. So thank you. That's a very well taken statement. It basically pushes that up the priority list, and we will work on that. Secondly is you touched on the specifics of education data and understanding how government functioning in education systems. We agree completely. This is actually a topic that is very mature because there has been a lot of effort in understanding education system data. That, I think, in some sense, I'd love you to email us. We can, have a separate discussion. We've been involved in the Global Education Policy Dashboard, and I think that summarizes at least the World Bank's thinking on doing government analytics within the education system. So if you just, and I'll put it in the chat, globaleducationpolicydashboard.org, that provides some both data, framework, and concept, and it links from the World Development Report on education. But your point is very well taken. This third bucket, that there's a politics of data. The only statement I would make there is that while there is certainly a politics of data, there is also a passive ineffectiveness of the use of data. And though we can have a conversation about the politics of data, there may be space to make improvements in the way we use data in education systems. And it's not that there will be active resistance, it just passively hasn't been done. And so I think we should talk about both camps. But all your points are extremely well taken. Watch the space of the government analytics community, and we'll try to get as much on what you're saying as possible. So thank you. Now, I noted that Kennedy does want to come back and respond to what I'd said. So what I'll do is we've only got a few minutes left. I'm going to see if anyone else wants to come in. Christian very kindly has been putting responses back into the chat. Anyone with a last burning question, or we'll give Kennedy the last few minutes. Okay, very good. Kennedy, do you want to come back in? You've put your hand down now.
Yeah, just for a few seconds. Thank you very much for yet another opportunity. Yeah, I was just going to ask, based on your experience, how can we get government buy-in in data analytics? Because it's one thing to do a very good analysis for which government can make their decision. Again, it is another thing for government to accept and to act on those insights that have been generated through those analytics. So how do we, because I'm talking from the standpoint of the global south that I mentioned, because it's often a challenge, okay? Especially when a government has something to hide. So how do we ensure that, hey, we are not policing you, but rather trying to ensure that we make your processes better and more transparent? Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Kennedy, for the question. Let me respond to that in two ways. The first is, I'm also a researcher. Let me briefly talk about my own experience. When I started this work, we had a project where we said we would survey central government employees in 10 countries around the world. It's one of my first grant projects, and including in Africa, and Latin America, and Eastern Europe, and Asia. And everybody told us we're crazy. They're never going to allow you to do this. Because we are surveying them about questions such as politicization in the civil service. Why would governments be willing to allow you to do that? And I think ultimately we were able to survey more countries than we expected, and this effort has continued. And I think part of the reason is that it's ultimately a conversation. Ultimately, the important thing is to frame the conversation around learning. You're irrespective of your political space. I think we can make a general assumption that most public managers want to do better within their political constraints. And the question is, how can you help them? And the data can help them in many ways. And so we found that as a researcher, I found a lot of governments to be more open to this than you might think. And that also relates to a point that Dan mentioned earlier, that is, you can say, well, the procurement data, for instance, isn't complete, it isn't great, it has holes. The payroll data isn't complete, it has holes. Until somebody actually goes to the government and tries to help them analyze it, governments themselves often don't really know. And that is precisely why it's so important to teach more people how to do this, to teach more people how to actually look at the data set, like a procurement data set, to try to understand how you can actually analyze it. Because then in the conversation with governments, improvements can happen to say, well, actually, you're right, we can't really get the analytics insights we want here because we have all these gaps. But we could tweak something in our admin system, and then we won't have those gaps in the future. And that's, again, why we think you're so important, because ultimately the change is going to come about by country, having lots of people that can do this, that engage with government where it's possible. There's so many different government analytics data sources. Some might politically not be possible, but there'll be many others that will be possible. And so engaging in those, improving the quality of the data, and then ultimately improving the quality of the analytics. So we very much hope that you'll join us in this effort, and that you take up this opportunity to teach this. And as mentioned, Dan and I are very, very keen to support you in this effort. So do get in touch with us if we can help you.
Yeah, thank you, Christian. Thank you, everyone, for participating. I really wish we could literally have a session in which each of you presents your own perspectives. We will very much continue to try to find the resources to build a stronger community, an in-person community. So be patient with us, keep being in touch with us, keep being in touch with each other. We're happy to kind of communicate work you've been doing. And, though we're over now, we hope this is the start of a long and vibrant conversation. Thank you so much for joining, everyone. Wishing you a good evening, very late evening to a few of you, evening, afternoon, lunch, morning, etc. And wishing you well. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Bye.
Thank you.